Thanks. Yeah, no, it's yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate you all taking the time to tune in a format that obviously until Corona was saved for far more boring things than the music industry, but we've adapted and evolved, and here we are. And I'm looking forward to answering your questions. You know, I'll kind of have a short introduction about myself and a little bit of my background and where I've come from and how I got to where I am now. And then I think what I'd like to do is to kind of maybe outline a few things in the first instance of what could be beneficial to discuss. But then I'd like it really to be quite free flowing, you know, in terms of any questions or thoughts or queries. And given the nature of this format, you know, I think from what I can understand, you can either type it in the chat section or you can type it in the Q&A section, and I'll figure it out as we go along. And I'll kind of just respond in kind, and I'm sure the answers to those questions will spark new thoughts of conversation and topics that we need to discuss. But yeah, so me, I guess I started out in the music industry from a journalistic standpoint. I was, I guess, starting when pre-Spotify, when a Hype Machine, SoundCloud, blogs were the main form of music discovery. And I set up a music blog called Crack in the Road a long, long time ago, which at the time was very relevant. But now, obviously, the world has changed dramatically. But it gave me my first entry point into music industry, and it was a way I, you know, discovered and premiered artists, but also met A&R people and managers and PR and whatever else. And that allowed me to kind of figure out a career path, which I say figure out has actually been quite roundabout and cyclical. But I kind of moved from blogging into PR and radio. So I was kind of a big part of understanding how we were transitioning from traditional media through to online and through to internet radio and all those things. And it was through that I met a chap called Phil Taggart, who's a Radio 1 DJ in the UK. And he had a record label called Hometown Records, which went through Sony. And that was my first A&R gig about 6 years ago. And I scouted there, discovered a number of kind of very talented UK artists and sort of European artists, Rat Boy and Reggie Snow and a few others. And I then moved into A&R role at Virgin Records, and then most recently an A&R role at Atlantic Records. So I've kind of had the benefit of working across all three major labels in the UK at a time when, you know, the music industry as a whole has evolved rapidly, but also the role of major labels and A&R as a concept has also drastically changed. And throughout that period, I was also managing writer-producers in the first instance. So I managed a writer-producer duo called The 23rd, who I guess are mostly known for their track with Sigrid called Plot Twist, but they've also done a number of things with, you know, Alma, James Arthur, Astrid S, you know, quite cool old pop stuff. So I kind of worked with them, and I got a real insight into the world of songwriting and production and the way that that world worked, and the world of publishing, because they signed a publishing deal to Sony ATV. And then as I was at Atlantic, I decided to move more into artist management, and I can kind of come into that in a little bit later, but I manage a Norwegian artist called Girl in Red, a UK artist called Aquilo, and a artist producer called Hugo White, who was in a British band called the Maccabees. And I'd say it's in that work I've primarily made the most sort of learning experiences and inroads into having as detailed and as contemporary understanding of the music industry as it is. You know, I think there is no closer you can be now to the center point of everything that's happening is if you're an artist, because to be an artist now, even compared to 5 years ago, has totally changed. You know, you're in a position now where there is no one route to market anymore, and the tools of technology and the ways of distribution have all evolved now, where artists really can, if they want to be, really in charge of their own destiny. And I've been able to be a part of that journey by working as an artist manager, also a role that has changed hugely in the time that I've been doing it, and certainly over the past 5, 10, 15 years, because of how much more holistic it is, and the way that, you know, you work with artists that want to be in charge of their own intellectual property and their own branding and imagery. It's a lot more of a intrinsic role than it used to be, than when it was simply more focused on business management or diary management or any of those things. So a lot of lines have been blurred, and I think now is the time of opportunity. But obviously, all caveated by this ongoing pandemic, which has caused another whole set of changes or potential changes to an industry that is really, being hit by some of the really blunt and direct effects of a pandemic, which is social distancing, from a live gig perspective, from a meeting perspective, in a globally smaller world, in the way we're connecting more through, streaming or through, video, through social media, to then have all of that just stopped in a way, insofar as offline versions of that, to kind of not have the parity of both. It used to be one went hand in hand with the other, but to then be restricted to online is, it's caused a lot of issues, but I think also potentially could reset a few things that are maybe a bit antiquated, a bit old fashioned, and open up some new doorways. So I guess that's kind of like a brief overview. And I guess, today we can talk a little bit about how I've been, working under the current climate and what I've learned, certainly before and after these things have happening. And the way that we can, I can help advise how you can, reach everything from your current audience to new audience to industry. But certainly, from here on in, if there are any questions, to kind of kick us off, or any particular thoughts, there's almost 100 of you in here now. Please do air them, even if it's more for me just to see whether the chat and the Q&A is working. But if there isn't any questions, I guess I can choose a start point. Oh, great. Chat is working. Thank you, Peter. I guess my question to begin with actually is to understand a little bit of the room. Is it primarily artists in the room? You can kind of just do an affirmative yes or a thumbs up emoji. Or is there any sort of other people, writers, producers, or are we looking mostly at artists? Great. Got a whole wave of yeses. You've all turned up to the right meeting. Great. Okay. We've got mostly artists then. So in that sense, does anyone have any immediate questions? And I'll kind of give like a sort of a 20 second sort of window for people to ask those. And if they do, let's go from there. If not, I can start at another point. I'm just watching all of the delayed yeses come in, which is great. And this is the first time I've ever done a webinar, so bear with me. Okay, here we go. How to present yourself in the best way in terms of singles to record labels. I think that's a good question, because I think the answer is both transcendental of the current situation we're in, but also now impacted by the situation we're in. So I think in terms of just general good practice, I think, there are certain etiquette that you can follow to create something that would be more attractive for a label to either listen to or to look into. And I think it's about being selective. I think it's about having faith in the music you're making. So not kind of offloading everything, onto a label or onto an A&R at a label immediately, because I try and liken it to kind of just any other sort of social interaction. When you meet someone for the first time, ideally, you don't just tell them your life story in that first meeting. You don't just lay everything on the line, because ultimately that's just not how relationships work. And your relationship is with an A&R or a label is very much that. It just so happens to be about music and potentially a career. So I'd be selective with what it is you present. So that's in terms of 2-3 songs, and I don't think they all have to be perfectly finished. I just think A&R people are actually more excited by and interested in things that aren't too developed, because obviously, there is the binary relationship between artist and A&R and artist and label. Like, there has to be a mutual input. And as a result, they're kind of conditioned to hear things, unfinished and unformed, and just kind of want to hear the things that make it truly special. And I think, to answer your question about how to present yourself the best way, it's about being honest and authentic, don't try and present something you think they want to hear or see, because ultimately they will have seen that a million times. And you want to present something that you think is intrinsically you, because it sounds cliche, but ultimately there's only one of you. So, you can do what you want yourself the most justice. So maintain any, any of the music, like what it's subject matter, the imagery, the brief bio you might give beforehand, all those things. You want to make sure that it's not anything you feel uncomfortable with, because if you feel uncomfortable with it, they will definitely sense that. And I think, part of not giving them everything is also increasing the likelihood of, curiosity and finding out more about who you are and what you're doing. And, the sort of things I looked for in artists beyond the music, in terms of was motivation. If I got an email from someone who said, here's 3 songs, here's the artwork, attached on the SoundCloud link or whatever. And here's links to all my social media, and here's some acoustic covers of the tracks I've been doing on YouTube. Just initiative, I think, because ultimately, even if your question was in the context of singles, I think it's a wider point of how do you present yourself generally, and it's about an artist that knows what they want to do and how they want to do it. Even if that knowledge isn't totally complete, there's a willingness there to really engage with a label or an A&R person progressively, as opposed to what can you do for me? Because ultimately, if you go in like that, you're automatically not doing yourself any justice or favors, because you're giving the leverage to the other party, but you're also not presenting a particularly exciting thing. Because I think all of the best artists that I know in the world, aren't one machine people. Like they do have other people that help them with a lot of what they do, but they are the center point of a lot of the ideas. So I guess if I missed anything there, if there's anything specific, feel free to ask, but I won't focus too long on any one question. But looking at the next question, how to get a deal with physical and digital distribution companies as a newly started label. I think now is probably the best time to be asking that question, because there has never been a more healthier landscape for distribution, because now it's not just a means to an end, it's a whole new market in itself. And I think to begin with, it all starts a little bit with, what's your label like? What's it about? At what stage it's at? How many artists do you or do you not have signed? To what extent do you have them signed or want to? All these questions are like the practical things should really lead this conversation, because ultimately that will inform the sort of deal you have or the sort of deal you want, because every distribution company is different. Obviously, I've worked extensively with AWOL, but, I've also had good relationships with people like Ingrooves, Believe, The Orchard, ADA, they all, and now because it's becoming an increasingly more competitive marketplace, the distributors are having to separate themselves a lot more than simply we'll upload your music to the various DSPs. They can offer various different things that come with a deal, whether that's a level of financing, a level of team resource. A lot of these distribution companies now are employing product managers, international managers, a lot of things that would add value to whatever sort of deal you might want to strike. But then again, also, if it's just simply, I just want the bare bones, then a lot of these companies are now offering really competitive deals. So in terms of how to get one, I'd probably make sure I was totally itemized and aware of what it is I was bringing to the table as the label in question and what I'd want. And then I think and I would then, as I mentioned, they're all very different, the distribution. So I would do my own research and go, which one of these distributors best fits from the outside looking in my mantra? Like, what other artists do they work with? What other labels do they work with? Who are they associated with? Because, it's important that, you recognize that not everything's going to fit the same, even though distribution is less personalized per se than a label, like a major label. It's still going to have its own twists and quirks. Where's the HQ? Where do they have offices? Where don't they have offices? So I think a lot of that onus is then on you. And then when you kind of figured that out, in terms of what it is the label is that you're bringing to the distributor, which distributor is your top 3, a case of then is approaching them. And approaching them can simply be a cold call email, which I've seen work plenty of times with distributors, because their business model works on, en masse a little bit. It's a lot less selective, so they'll be a lot more open to inquiries. Or it's just research, of kind of going, right, okay, cool, who are the spokespeople for these distribution companies, who've done the interviews online, and working your way that way. And that initiative element will really help. But certainly, if after this question or after this call, if there is if you had more of a specific idea per se of a distributor or of what your needs were, I might be able to offer a slightly more direct answer. But generally, that would be the way I would go about it. How to secure your copyrights as a songwriter? I guess, again, your first port of call as a songwriter, if you are a self-published or unpublished songwriter, is to work with your local performing rights organizations, which obviously I think it's Tono here. I should explain that I work with Girl in Red, but I've only recently moved to Norway myself, like about a month ago. So I'm still learning a lot of the ins and outs of the domestic world here, but I've learned a lot through working with Marie. But yeah, performing rights organizations, 100%, they will very much be in a position to walk you through exactly what needs registering and how it needs registering. And also, you know, how they can work with international partners, other performance rights organizations across the world. I'm not sure if it's as common here, but in the UK, you know, it's very regular for songwriters and artists to have specific music sort of attorneys or lawyers that work with them in a way that's very understanding of their position. So a lot of lawyers in the UK will work with artists and songwriters in the early stages, but not like bill their hourly rate, obviously, because they don't want to bankrupt the people they're working with. So a lot of these lawyers, if they like what you're doing and have a contact base, they will work, you know, pro bono to help you get set up. And they are, without a doubt, will be the most impartial, most trusted third-party people you can work with, because they're in their actual industry, their side of things, the legal industry, has a code of conduct that, you know, they have to follow, which is obviously a rarity in the music industry. So I think having that sort of information to hand would be really useful. And then obviously, you know, you eventually progress to potentially a publishing deal or an admin deal. And then that is, you know, pending the partner you work with, probably the most secure way of working, you know, your copyrights as a songwriter, because they're going to, you know, be very much an international framework of not only kind of collecting and organizing your royalties, but disputing anything that needs to be disputed with a greater force behind you than just yourself, and also sourcing new opportunities, which, you know, in turn will further secure the copyrights you already have. Tips on international strategies in releasing your own music. That's a big question. So I guess I'll answer briefly, and obviously we can have follow-ups and stuff. But I think international strategies are very artist dependent. So, you know, now I would advocate, if people already aren't, using all of the tools you have available. So that, you know, with the DSPs, Spotify for artists, Apple Music for artists, which obviously now includes Shazam data. Amazon have just released Amazon for artists app. A lot of these, you know, obviously different countries around the world will use DSPs very differently, you know, and that's, you know, what might be popular in Norway is not what's popular in the Philippines, or what's not popular in Latin America. And a large part of that, you know, without going too far down the rabbit hole, is to do with telecommunications plans. A lot of these countries in Latin America or Southeast Asia, certain mobile data plans are linked to different DSPs. So if, like, you get a mobile SIM and automatically free subscription to Deezer or to Spotify, or free, you know, and this also extends to social media. You know, Facebook is less relevant in Western Europe, but it's still huge in South America. So, you know, my first tip would be to not let domestic biases affect the way you approach an international strategy, and to learn as much about the different places that you are interested in evolving in as best as possible, you know, and that's figuring out what social media is popular there, what DSPs are popular. And I guess to make your time even more efficient, using these DSP apps to really understand where your fans already are, because it would make total sense to start and build from those cities or countries first, because ultimately everyone you work with and yourself, you know, in the confidence of how you release music, you know, there's people there already. You're not going in a totally blank slate. And I think momentum tends to beget momentum. So let's say you kind of, you know, majority of your audience is in Norway, but then you've got a spike in France, a spike in Germany, and a spike in Australia. Then I would then go, right, okay, cool. How do these markets work as best as I can understand? What social media do they tend to use? What, you know, like, and then, you know, I've noticed with artists I work with, the top cities in Spotify are totally different to top cities in Apple Music. And that's again down to culture of what's used more where. And obviously certain countries are going to be more accessible than others in terms of how one approaches them. So identifying audience and identifying audience behavior, I think is step one. And then I think in terms of the strategy thereafter, it's kind of more reverse engineering. Like, what is it you want to achieve? And then figure out backwards from there how you get there. Because if you kind of just keep going forward without necessarily an end goal, that's when a lot of people can feel a little bit lost or a little bit exhausted, you know, either energy or financially. It's more like setting realistic goals, whether it's like, you know, I want to up my listenership in these cities by X number, or I want to make it onto these playlists, or the next time I go back there, I want to be able to sell this many tickets. And from there, I'd say it's about engaging with those fans very personally, you know, with the desired goals in effect. You know, it's whether it's, you know, targeting, you know, your social media posts to each city, or whether it's about engaging in some sort of online activity that kind of makes them know that you know they're there. Because I think that's the sort of the best part of social media, is being able to connect directly with fans, and that has a ripple effect. And if more people go, you know, wow, God, that person knows that I'm listening to them and I live in this town in France or Germany or whatever, it kind of really does knock on, and you start to see an algorithmic effect of this engagement rate really kind of creating a momentum. So, and then obviously on a more admin level, it also depends who you're working with and releasing your music. It also depends on how you want to, I guess, you know, further the relationship you have with a distributor or a record label, because they will equally have a big part of how your strategy works, the tools they have at their disposal, and the monetary things that might go into, you know, digital advertising, or whether it's asset creation, you know. But that's much more specific to people's setups personally. But I think in generalities, it's about using the tools you have, identifying your audience correctly, and then speaking directly to them. And that's, you know, something that they'll really appreciate. Sorry, I'm just moving down now to other questions, and I'll try and be relatively brief and not go on for too long. Okay, Annalisa has written a Corona song and needs to get out there while people are still in quarantine, which makes a lot of sense. Without wanting to sound too pessimistic, but potentially optimistic for your set of circumstances, I wouldn't worry about time being limited. I know obviously in certain countries, including Norway, they are going to gently lift restrictions, but there are great swathes of the world that also haven't had any indication that they're going to be lifting lockdown or quarantine. And I think, in all honesty, it's going to take a very long time for normality to return in any sort of function that we're used to seeing it in. So I think, not to take, you know, any emphasis away from your want to get going quickly, but don't stress over it. I think there's going to be a lot of quarantine left for all of us. And my only kind of word of caution there is that ultimately, you know, by the sounds of it, you know, you have an idea of maybe how you've marketed or promoted records you've released before. So you have some level of reference, but I think it's about messaging, because I kind of, you know, there's a lot of things that are happening in this period that people are being very innovative and interesting with. You know, there was the Via Live Festival last week, or into this week, I guess, which, you know, took a very progressive, high production value towards live streaming, because live streaming has become a huge thing during this period. But, you know, was at the risk of becoming quite worn out quite quickly. And as a result, that the reason why I think that got as much airtime as it did was because they really went out of their way to make sure it looked and sounded great, like it was a real experience. Because, you know, there's the low bar of entry of having a webcam and being able to perform means that obviously it's great that we have those tools and people can engage, and it's better than being totally isolated. But also, you know, in the way that so much music is uploaded all the time, it increased the volume of just visual content. And as human beings, we have a very limited capacity of how long we can remain engaged in things, potentially even this webinar, but I'll remain optimistic about that. But it's important that whatever you do separates itself from the noise. And it's a catch-22. Obviously, it's a very contemporary subject. We're living in it, we're breathing it, no one's talking about anything else. But inversely, it might also get lost in it. So I think it's great initiative to be making music about the times you're in, but I would just, in your question of how to promote and market it, I just think very carefully about how I could go about it in a way that would separate itself, whether that's indirect or whether it's something novel or interesting or lateral or unexpected, just something that kind of allows it to kind of be what it is. It's a song regarding the current pandemic, but also approaches people in a moment of refreshment, whether it's an angle, whether it's a visual or something, just because otherwise the risk is it could get lost a little bit in the noise. Okay, so how to build a team. Sorry, let me just get the whole question up. How to build a team. Management, booking, etc. How to build the kind of hype that makes these kind of people want to get engaged. Very good question. So I guess there's no one sort of smooth answer to that, because obviously every artist is different, every discovery is different. But I think first and foremost, you kind of need to identify what team members you feel you really need at the point you're in and why you need them. Because I agree, over time, people will need more and more like hands at the deck, to kind of get things done and open doors and experience. But you certainly shouldn't be adding people for the sake of it, because some of the questions, some of the team members you add now, are going to be some of the most important decisions you make, especially when it's a manager, because, obviously relationships come and go, but like, wherever you start is quite indicative of where you carry on. So my advice generally has been to implore a lot of patience with new artists. Like, don't just jump at the first meeting you have or the first conversation you have just for the sake of feeling like you've got somebody else in your corner, because it's more about the quality of that person and their intentions than it is simply having the name or the email address. And always trust your gut, and I'm a big believer in that. I think because what we do is so innately personal and human, the gut instinct factor is really relevant in the sort of business decisions we should make. So never subdue that, even if it looks great. Things that tend to look great as opportunities, unless they feel great, tend to have some caveat, even if you don't really see them to begin with. So when if I was talking for myself as a manager or an A&R person, and when I've approached artists before, and I kind of answered the question a little bit earlier, but in a slight more detail, things I'd be attracted to would be an artist that is obviously ambitious, and you do that through your activity online. I think as long as if I see somebody who's proactive in their social media, if I see somebody who's put some level of thought into the artwork, I think, and that doesn't mean like it has to be particularly professional, just something interesting, something that's like, wow, that's different, that's going to stand out. And similarly with the music, I think a lot of the music can do a lot of the talking for you, because there's never been more new eyes on new music now, whether it's me, whether it's an A&R person, whether it's an editor at Spotify or Apple Music, or whether it's YouTube. Like, it's in more and more people's interest now, more than ever, to be involved in new music in a way that it used to just be labeled, because they controlled the only way you could actually perform a career. So don't, even if something isn't immediate, be comforted by the fact there are more people than ever looking at what you're doing now than there ever have been. So your odds are increasing exponentially. But I think the way that will excite people to want to work with you is things that should be what you're doing when you're not working with them, before and after a working relationship, which is proactivity and professionalism, and just doing something different, trying to figure out what is it I'm bringing to the table, and highlight those things in your activity than anything you think people might want to see or hear. Because, I'm not bothered about seeing big numbers to begin with. I'm not bothered about seeing, a business plan or a finished entity, because those things should come with time. I just want to see people who really have a genuine enthusiasm and an ambition to separate themselves and to really make a difference. And I think that manifests itself totally different with different people. So it's not as easy as going, make this video or do this post. It's not that. It's more like an energy. And yes, and I just plead with people to have patience. I know it's hard, but if what you're doing, you believe in enough, people will come to it eventually, because you won't stop doing it, and you'll think about it all the time, and you'll obsess about it, and you'll add more to it, and it will eventually reach the surface rather. And I think that's really how people would inevitably get engaged. Um, okay, let me figure out. Okay, is it better to spread out many singles to keep interest over a longer time, or is it better to release fewer singles and have more songs on one album? Again, I think I hesitate to come up with one general rule because I think every artist is different and every circumstances is different. Speaking from experience, with Girl in Red, you know, as some of you may know, we released her EP last year, Chapter 2, which was a 5-track EP. And we did 5 songs over the course of, I think it was roughly 8 months. And that meant we released them roughly every sort of 6 to 8 weeks. And it was an EP in name only. It became an EP once all the tracks were out. But effectively, it was 5 singles that were then pulled together. And the reason why we did that was for her at that stage of her career, she didn't really have much else out. She had the first EP out, but she'd done that pretty much on her own, or at least the first half of it. This was more like all 5 songs felt like they had their own story. They all sonically different. They all had a different ambition and a different side of who she was. So it felt a shame to kind of just take a couple of those songs as singles and then just put the rest out all in one day, because we wanted to have moments with each song. We wanted, you know, the first song, Watch You Sleep, very quiet, melancholic song, perfect song to start the year with, get everyone out of winter. It kind of showed a side to her that no one had really seen before. And then over time, we progressed into songs that were more ambitious from a production perspective, from a commentary perspective of what they were talking about and the lyrics. And each time we did it, it allowed the small team we built to create mini strategies. So like it kept the ambition in check, because it wasn't like we pinned everything on an EP release. We were like, cool, okay, this single, we want to do this, this, and this. And then you get 4 weeks to go, well, we got this, but we didn't get that. We learned this. Let's apply these learnings to the second one. And through that, you know, we kind of learned a lot that I think is going to be really beneficial when it comes to releasing the album. And I think what we did was also give our audience an opportunity to really feel like they were part of the discovery journey. Because if we'd released a single in January, single in March, and then the rest of the EP came out in one lump in May, you know, we would limit the window of opportunity for people to get on board the train as it was moving. Because I think there's an innate part of humanity, or whether it's just our ego, that we like to feel like we're part of something, whether it's early or whether it's during, but just not to feel late to something and not to feel excluded from something. So that definitely worked for us as well. But again, you know, it is also very dependent upon where you're at in your career and what it is you want to achieve. And, you know, certainly when it comes to Girl in Red's album, you know, we're going to be approaching it very differently in some senses to the EP. You know, I think we are going to still release a lot of music, but it's not going to be exactly the same concept, because an album is a different body of work, you know, in terms of socially, culturally, philosophically, you know, it's different. And she's grown as a person and as an artist. So we will adapt and evolve. But what I can say is by putting more music out earlier with a strategy meant we build an audience exponentially quicker than we would have done. And I think we also built a more committed audience who are in for the longer journey. So yeah, again, you know, it's relevant to your own set of circumstances, but I think, you know, I would advise being very aware of your current stage of development, and also ultimately staying true to yourself. You know, I think there are certain artists who probably would hate the idea of releasing a 5-track EP as 5 singles, because, you know, it wouldn't be true to the nature of an EP, because ultimately people will have already heard most of it. But it depends on who your audience is. It depends on what you want to achieve. But I would try and find a way of telling a story, and whether that's for you is that's releasing more or it's releasing less, again, is very dependent on your circumstances. Okay. Great. I got confirmation on Tono. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. How is the pandemic affecting international managements? Do you think it's better for artists to wait to contact management for new collaborations? I think it's important to kind of view the lens of the pandemic in a much broader sense. You know, obviously it's affecting everything, you know, not just the music industry, but the way we all live our lives day to day. And you can't separate those things. Like, this is going to have such cataclysmic generational effect change in every sense. So I think it's not surprising that ultimately the the music industry is kind of convulsing a little bit. And, I think it will have both positive and negative effects in terms of the way that people contact and start relationships, because you don't have access to the things that you otherwise would, like meeting people in person or attending conferences or anything like that. So do I think it's better for artists to wait or to carry on? It's almost an unanswerable question, because everyone's going to be affected by this differently. I know artist managers who, very significant artist managers who had artists meant to be touring and releasing albums now, and obviously they can't do that, so it's really affected their business. So I would imagine they're having to double down on their current clients than necessarily worry about taking new ones on. So in normal times they might be more receptive. Now they might be a bit more closed off. But conversely, there will be other people who are looking for opportunity and looking to connect, because they've got less to do. Maybe they weren't releasing something now with their clients, but they've had to push back things that were upcoming. So they're kind of more like looking for other opportunity and trying to future plan a little bit for when normality arrives. So it's very dependent upon people's circumstances. What I'd say is that, as an eternal optimist, I wouldn't down tools, and I'm not downing tools, in the face of something like this. Yes, it makes it harder and you have to create a lot more contingency plans, but I would go about it with the same level of passion and enthusiasm you would even if this wasn't happening. And it might just mean certain conversations take longer, but you'd be surprised, the amount of unexpected things that come from a scenario like this, which is obviously inherently unexpected. Okay, here we go. Oh, sorry about the hitting the desk with a pencil. I apologize about that. I guess it's a nervous tick of mine. I'm really sorry if everyone's been super affected by that. I will, and that was a while ago. I'm very sorry, Peter. Okay. I will keep going. How did I first hear about Girl in Red? It was played to me by someone who worked in the Norwegian music industry, and they kind of very just, I guess, informally and kind of off the cuff were like, oh, there's this thing. She's a girl called Marie who's working on this project. You should listen to it. I think it's really cool. So I listened to it roughly 2 years ago now, and she'd already put out I Want to Be Your Girlfriend, I Want to Be Your Girlfriend, Summer Depression, and Say Anything from the first EP, and I just immediately loved it. I was just like, oh God, I was just over the moon by hearing something that I was so not expecting to hear, and something that was so raw and visceral. And, again, the benefit of streaming, the benefit of social media meant that it could make its way fairly indirectly to me. And I certainly didn't discover it on my own. And from there, I flew to Norway, and I pretty much met her the same week I heard the music, and just kind of heard her out and listened to her vision and understand her ambition for what she wanted to do, and just felt quite an instant connection, which is very important for me with the way I work. And it was from there, really, the rest is history. We kind of spent a couple of months getting to know each other, and then started working together sort of summer of 2018, and it's been kind of one constant development since then. But yeah, very, very, very grateful that I was in the right place at the right time to hear her music. How to approach as a songwriter at a young age? I assume that means how to start being a songwriter or a career of a songwriter at an early point. And again, that's a very personal question, in the way that music and its creation is very personal. But I have been to a number of music schools over the course of my life, or my professional life, both in Scandinavia and both in the UK. And I think formal education as a songwriter is something to really consider, but only if it's something that you really feel like you'll get a lateral benefit from, because obviously, there's a lot of theoretical aspects that go into being a songwriter. And I think the more you know those things, the better, because ultimately the more you know how things are meant to work traditionally, the more you're able to then invert those things and create something interesting. And what I've actually found is music schools, such as Limpi in Norway or Musikmarkene in Sweden, I've had more of a respect for than some of the schools in the UK, just because they were far more realistic and method minded than some of the schools in the UK that try and went for more of a broad strokes of here's a taster of everything of what it's like to be in the music industry, as opposed to how do we harness your craft as a songwriter, and both give you as much practice at doing that as possible with similar like minds, but also then, I think certain schools, Music Machina, the way it worked is you got a full year working at the school in the middle of nowhere in the north of Sweden with 30 other kids. You all had your own studio and you just made music all the time, just made. And then I think the second year was spent a year in industry. You had to find your own internship, and that could be anything in the music industry. And I think that was as important as the first year, because ultimately it's one thing to be a really good songwriter, but if you don't understand how the industry works around you, you're going to be hamstrung a little bit, because you're going to not understand, who am I writing these songs with? Who am I writing them for? What do I get? How do I make money out of them? How do I protect myself in them? What sorts of characters or individuals am I going to meet and potentially work with over the course of my career? All those things are as important. So I definitely think about education to some extent as far as specific songwriter or music industry education, but I would only do it if you felt a real connection to whatever course or school it was you were looking at. On a more holistic sense, I don't want to go into too much detail because I'm not a songwriter myself. I've critiqued songwriters multiple times, either as a journalist or as an A&R or whatever, but I just think from a common sense perspective, practice makes perfect. You can never write enough songs. You can never listen to enough songs. You can never, kind of feel like you've written your best song, because ultimately the one after that should be better. And you'll have milestones in your career and you'll have moments to kind of go, yeah, I really achieved something there. But ultimately, people, Beyonce still gets singing lessons. Like, you will always only find your potential by practice. And I think from what I can understand, working with songwriting producers, the networking aspect is very important, because ultimately songwriters tend to form social groups, as I'm sure some of you guys already have, but like you're inevitably going to create more interesting and forward-thinking things, I think, with people that you trust and that you feel comfortable around and challenge you. So I'd be very proactive at forging those relationships, and they may not come immediately, and they may not come, the best ones might not be the first ones, but like being proactive in that and taking the time to learn, to be open, and to especially if you want to be like a pop songwriter, I guess, to kind of understand what it means to really make a song, in the context you're making it, and that will inevitably revolve on others. There are very, very few people in the world who don't have any third-party involvement in what they're doing, and certain people actually crave it. So it's about figuring that out, I think. Okay. If you want to work with another publisher or label, is it a deal breaker if you already have a license deal, or that could be a quality sign? I think ultimately there is no restrictions beyond simply your current contractual obligations. I think if you're in a scenario where you have some sort of deal, but it's either coming to an end or it has a break clause, those things are the only things that would be relevant. I think if you're a publisher or a label looking at an artist or a songwriter and you really like what they're doing, obviously depending on how your working relationship has been with the people you're currently working with, like if they've helped what you're doing and you feel like it's progressed what you're doing, and the third party looking at you potentially to work with you is seeing really positive end results of what you're doing, I think it's a bonus. And to borrow your phrasing, it could be a sign of quality. I certainly wouldn't ever see it as a burdenous thing or a thing that would be limiting, only because, it demonstrates that, you've been able to forge relationships and people have taken a chance on you and they've worked with you. The only things that would be restrictive would simply be if you couldn't get out of those deals or when you could get out of them. So I think it's not something to be worried about. I think it's something that you should just find the positives in. Okay. Okay, I've been reminded of what the webinar is called, How to Contact the Global Music Market. Could you highlight some practical examples of how to make contact? 100%. So I think a large part of that is definitely dependent upon the way that you want to approach those people and who you want to approach and why you want to approach them. Because in a way, a lot of things haven't changed. You know, obviously, whilst you can't meet these people in person as much anymore, you know, there's obviously the emails and other forms of online communication have existed for some time. So a lot of these infrastructures are still remaining. So that it's not like some sort of gates or doors have automatically opened and everyone is now even more accessible than they once were. It just means that you have to be more inventive and interesting, I think, and lateral with the tools you already have. So, you know, I don't want to go on too much about how I would contact each individual person, but if you kind of wanted to mention, and we have enough time, a specific person or profession that you'd be interested in reaching out to, I can talk about it. But I can talk about anecdotal examples, I guess, of the way you can kind of make the most of separating yourself under the current restrictions. So, again, depending on who you're working with and how you're working with them, you know, I know a lot of people now when they're releasing music, you know, you're not able to do, or your distribution companies or your labels aren't able to do face-to-face meetings with editors at playlists or DSPs. So I know people who've worked on creating short form video clips that are attached to each individual song from the artist as it's being distributed or pitched to the various DSPs like Spotify and Amazon, you know, each personalized to each service. And the artist themselves is able to kind of go, hey, such and such, this song was born out of this feeling and it's happening now in these really weird times. And it's kind of, you know, you kind of very honestly explain to them, you know, the purpose of why you're releasing that song, how you're releasing it. And, you know, in a way that really you wouldn't have that opportunity in the current, under non-pandemic sort of scenarios, because the infrastructure of how it was done would have just remained the same. It would be like, this is where you put the song in, it'll get pitched this week and it'll be done this way. But now, because a lot of that can't happen, it's breaking a lot of the chains. So if you can be inventive and personal with the way you approach these things, it's inevitably going to separate yourself and what you're doing from that. So that's something I'd say in terms of how you'd separate your music when you're trying to approach the global music market. And I think the way of viewing the question generally is not too direct. You know, I'm not going to tell you exactly how to reach a manager or reach a label directly, because like I said, a lot of those people are still doing their jobs and still contactable. It's more like, how do you contact the world indirectly? Because now everyone, you know, is so online, so on their screen, you know, in a way you're competing with everyone else online, but you're also, you've got a captured market. You know, there's a lot of things people normally do in their lives they can no longer do for a period of time. So they're focusing a lot of their energies on entertainment online. So it's about being very authentic to approaching what sort of strategy you have of the way you present yourself, whether it's innovative content, you know, that's relative on your Instagram or TikTok or Twitter or any sort of, or YouTube, that kind of just like gives people even more of an insight into who you are. Because like I said, people are now looking more intently online and discovery than they ever have. So you use the opportunity to be really inventive. Don't kind of be, you know, oh, you can buy this here or you can find this here. Like, kind of figure out things, you know, whether it's, you know, I know one artist that I'm working with who has decided to do a series of cooking videos, and because they've got quite an international audience, and they're kind of doing it as like a hybrid Q&A thing with their audience of like, hey, where are you in the world? Tell me where you're from, and I'm going to try and make your local dish, and I'll live stream me making it or whatever, or highlights. And that might, like, it's not for everyone. Some people might find that cringy, but I think for them, it was them kind of going, you know, how do I reach the global music market in a way that's very personal and very engaging? And that was one way of doing it, because ultimately it's filling the gap that those people may have otherwise found alternate forms of entertainment. And if you're doing things like that, it shows a proactivity, it shows a connectivity. And if I'm a manager or an A&R person, that's the sort of thing I'm going to notice, because ultimately that sort of spike is going to have a ripple effect somewhere down the line, and I'm going to see it happen. And I'm going to be like, wow, okay, that person really in these sorts of times hasn't just laid down. They're actually trying to be inventive and interesting. And arguably an artist's most important facet is their audience. Your audience is your everything. Outside of the music, the bigger the audience you can build, the more committed audience you can build, that will be to your eternal benefit, because the audience is king. You know, they are the ones that'll stream your music, buy the gig tickets, buy the merch. And if I'm a manager, or especially if I'm a label, cynically, I just want to find somebody who really has a target audience and an engaged audience, because that's going to make my job a lot easier in terms of how I help them build what they want to do. Okay, let's keep going, because I know we're into the sort of final 10 minutes or so, but it doesn't have to be too strict if people do want to hang around. How to take advantage of the corona situation? Is it better to focus your energy on songwriting and going to the studio this year to come back stronger in 2021? Again, totally dependent upon your set of circumstances. I think, you know, and where you were currently at in your planning and release cycle before the pandemic really kind of kicked in. All I can say is that ultimately it's, you know, something I've been preaching about a lot in this talk is that you do have a target audience now. You've got huge swathes of people that will be focusing their energies online. So in a way, it would make sense to kind of make the most of that. But when things do return to normality, you're going to see the bandwidth, I think, of promo, of radio, of, you know, of certain sort of even streaming will be much more limited. Because there'll be a lot of bigger artists or more established artists on labels who have inevitably delayed their releases because obviously the commerciality of what they're doing has a lot more factors to consider than necessarily an independent or a newer artist. They're going to take up a lot of that energy and that time and that awareness, because ultimately when things are normal, that's when they're going to want to try and release their music. So it's, again, it depends on who you are, the sort of music you're making, what it is you want to achieve. But I certainly wouldn't make an arbitrary decision. I wouldn't be like, well, you know, all my momentum's gone, I'm not going to do anything now, I'll hibernate. Nor would I kind of front end everything. It's got to be who you are. You know, I know Laura Marling, UK British artist, brought her album release earlier. She actually brought it sooner because she wanted to bring something out into the world that would be a positive thing and a beneficial thing and a constructive thing. And then other artists that have delayed it. So like ultimately it's got to be down to what it is you want to achieve and how you want to achieve it. But I definitely would suggest it's never a bad thing to want to better what you're doing and to make the strongest impact possible. So be honest, look at what you've got in front of you, your music, your assets. Does it need to happen now? You know, because it depends. If you haven't released a lot of stuff yet, there's not a great deal of pressure because there's a lot of people waiting for it. So, you know, you only really get one chance at a first impression. So it's all, the factors should be more dependent upon you than necessarily any third party context, I think. Okay. How is the pandemic affecting the music blogs, magazines? Are they still active these days? Or is it better to wait with new releases? This is a really good question because I do know for a fact that a large number of online and print publications have had to cut a large number of staff, you know, recently. And that's primarily as a result of a drop in advertising, because businesses now either are advertising, a lot of, you know, advertising on these websites would be for tours that are no longer happening. And also a lot of businesses that are having to trim down expenditure. And advertising is one of the first things that you would cut down if you're trying to consolidate money. So as a result, these publications that, like most businesses, weren't prepared for a immediate cease of cash flow have just had to lay off so many people, which is so bad. But ultimately, it's just the way they're trying to preserve there being a magazine or a blog to come back to after the pandemic has ceased. So there is definitely an obvious slowdown, I think, in terms of at least articles like interviews, reviews, long form, because there's just fewer people to be writing about them. And what I've noticed is a lot of publications have been using their social media a lot more, and artists have been, instead of kind of doing interviews or having reviews of new music, have been kind of submitting bedroom performances or Q&As or alternate forms of, you know, the Fader Fort did something. I know like a lot of other like blogs or websites are doing various sorts of visual video output. So if you've got like a new release to go, again, you know, if you're in a scenario where you haven't really got much context already, it is going to be hard to start because ultimately there's a lot less capacity for people to be promoting new music. But if you've already got a few releases under your belt and you've got a new one coming and you've got some base to work off, then it's more about how do I package this new release in a different way. So instead of going, I'm going to package it, I'm going to send it, and I'm going to hope for X number of reviews or interviews, I'm going to package it and either work on my own or with my PR person and go, let's send this to such and such, but let's offer them the opportunity to do a live Q&A or I'll send an acoustic video performance with it. because that's going to help these really struggling publications populate their websites, their social media, and will separate you from other people who are just submitting a song as they always would, because like I say, they have less they can do with that at the moment. So again, depends who you are, the music you're making, the level you're at, but it's definitely harder. So definitely expect it to be more difficult, but also, you know, if you feel like you can, be lateral with what it is you're submitting and how you submit it, and you might still surprise yourself with the results. Okay, working my way down to the next one. I'm actually going to open up the Q&A. Oh, right, sorry, some of the Q&A things automatically go into the chat, that's fine. Do you think staging online happenings, hoaxes, or theatre-like events can hurt more than the immediate attention it gives? I think it's very dependent on what it is you're doing. So, you know, I think content and the quality of that content is universal regardless of the time we're in. So I think there's been a lot of opportunism in this period where people who maybe aren't as capable, as in third-party organizers, have tried to put stuff together and it's not really looked or sounded that great because they're just trying to make the most of something that's happening. And that happens a lot when you have a sudden and absolute change of circumstances. The quality filter tends to disappear because there's a, you know, and it's good and bad because it does present some really brand new, exciting moments, but it can also, like I say, water down things that otherwise probably shouldn't be happening. So it's more, if you know, when I looked at the VIA Live thing, for example, that Girl in Red did, I think that was hugely beneficial to all those artists because the organizers really went the extra mile to work with really cool, inventive filmmakers, cool locations, and it was an added value. It wasn't simply for the sake of doing it. Whereas if you're doing something that doesn't add value, that's regardless of whether it's a pandemic or not. You know, if it's not going to add value, it's never going to, just because it's happening in a different circumstance, doesn't automatically change things. So I think you can do both. And I know that's the worst sort of answer to a question like this, but it is so specific on the sort of thing you're envisaging or you've been asked to do. And I think as long as you think it's interesting and you think it's honest, then, you know, your gut tends to be right. But I certainly wouldn't feel pressured into doing something for the sake of it, because ultimately you're right, it might actually hurt more than the attention it gives you. Okay, got a couple of Z's there, so maybe a couple of people falling asleep. Lassa, what is the best way to go about in email pitches pre-release if you're a publicist? I mean, again, I don't want to speak too much as a publicist because it's been a very long time since I've done that. But if I was in that sort of circumstance rather, knowing what I've just described, insofar as media organizations are losing staff, losing writers, losing capacity, and obviously the conversation is rattling around the pandemic itself, I would pitch very much realistically. You know, I'd broach the subject fairly full on, you know, and I think a lot of seasoned PR people will do this, of like, I know it's really hard at the moment, and, you know, I'd be very personal and human about the circumstances because, like I said, it's affecting everything, not just the music industry. And then just kind of take it into consideration, but not let it define what it is you're trying to pitch, you know, because good music and quality content is good music and quality content regardless of a pandemic or not. So, you know, I still think you can be very forthright with what it is you're pitching and how you're pitching it. You don't have to temper everything. You just have to be recognizing of the situation. And like I said, you know, anything you can do to give the person at the other end of that email more incentive to cover it, you know, whether it's a practical incentive of extra content or whether it's a, you know, an interesting angle on the song or the project, just that has a relevancy, you know, all those things will really help. But again, just general rules of good etiquette. I'd be precise, I'd be to the point, and I would be honest. That's kind of where I would focus it. I think I'm just checking the Q&A thing. I think I've answered a lot of those. Okay, yeah, sorry, I've got a new one here. As a relatively new band with only one song out, is there any point in trying to reach out to international venues and festivals? So at this point, I'd probably say that's not the best use of your time, only because a lot of these venues are either closed, or I have no idea when they're going to be reopening, and festivals are probably going to be the hardest hit, by virtue of the fact that they are the largest form of group activity in the music industry, even beyond sort of single venues. You know what I mean? So, they're all going to be in a relative hiatus, and not just from a creative perspective, but also just a business perspective, and the various sort of ramifications it will have for the parent companies that own these venues and festivals. So sadly, I think there's going to be a real hiatus on being able to forward those relationships, because they're just figuring out their own survival. And I think there's going to be a whole new paradigm of how venues, promoters, festivals work with booking agencies and artists. And that's going to be a whole thing in itself, beyond simply the usual discovering new music, discovering new artists. Like, the whole paradigm is going to shift. So whilst I wouldn't advise directly reaching out to these corporations or companies or promoters, I still think you can kind of build a bedrock of an artist project for when those conversations do inevitably open up again, that you've got even more to go to the table with than what you did now. Because if you're a new band with only one song, I imagine there's, by virtue of necessity, there's very little you could actually talk about beyond simply your one song, your ambition, and maybe some of the shows you've already done. But if you're approaching these venues and festivals at a point where you've released a number of songs and you've built up an even larger audience, whether that's social media or Spotify followers or whatever, that's going to only help you, because it's the live world is inevitably one of the most competitive places, because obviously in streaming, anyone can upload music and release it live. There are literally only a certain number of physical places a show can happen, and the costs are much more immediate and upfront. So for a promoter, it needs to be worthwhile for them to put these shows on. So the more you can demonstrate that when you do have those conversations, I think you're actually probably going to be in a better position than what you would be now. I'm just going to do a little one over just to see if I missed anything. No, I think I answered a majority of these. And I appreciate, obviously, we're in an hour now. So I don't want to necessarily go over more than I have to. But certainly, if there's any remaining questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, I think threading together everything I've talked about today, my feeling would be, make sure that this doesn't disavow or dismay any of you too drastically. These are really difficult times, and these are really unexpected and unprecedented times. And we can't forget the real human cost that this is having. But remember that in times like this, art and culture are at their most important. So it's important to remain present and outward and progressive. And within that, know that there is an end. And whatever you do now will have a purpose and a worth, and will hopefully benefit you when you get to the other side. So that's kind of, I guess, a little summary. And I've just noticed another question come in, which is slightly more specific, but could be relevant to other people here. My first debut song with vocals in March this year, just to get something out there, but I don't have a publisher, just distribution deal. How would having a publisher benefit someone wanting to release more music going forward? So I just kind of want to clarify whether this, you mean like, obviously you don't have a publisher, but you don't also, how would having a publicist? So I assume you mean a PR person, a promo person, than necessarily a compositional publisher. And if that's what you mean, sorry, just mean publisher. Okay, sorry. So you mean as in quite literally another publisher. So I guess a publisher for me is an important part of the puzzle, but isn't one of the most necessary ones, because publishing inherently is there really to just manage and collect your compositional royalties. Obviously, sync is a big part of that, but sync is also a really difficult thing, because brands primarily want to work with music that's already familiar, because if you're trying to sell something to someone, familiarity is really important. So like if you're Domino's or any other McDonald's, you kind of want to create music that either is trademarked to yourself or is so recognizable people will automatically connect to it. So sync is a hard one to get through, but is also an important part, and potentially could help increase your profile, but it's certainly not one of the more obvious things I'd be looking at. And that kind of leaves just publishers working on, like I say, collecting your compositional royalties, accounting them properly, and wherever they come, whether it's live or radio or streaming. I've not really worked with publishers where they've turned the dial more than what a label would, or a PR would, or a radio plugger would. And that's not because they don't try or they aren't capable. It's just not really their role. So I wouldn't worry too much about the publishing aspect. I think the things you'd look for from them is if you are looking for either, like I say, further development in your compositional work, whether it's like I say, collecting or sync, or whether it's you want to work with other songwriters and develop relationships in that world, because obviously that's something they work with a lot. It's their bread and butter. But to answer your question specifically, I don't think that should be your first thing. If you're kind of looking at, your first debut song with vocals and you've got a distribution deal, I'd be looking at trying to bring team members on that were more focused on PR, that were more focused on radio plugging or kind of social media, just because those things are going to progress your audience growth. And I think the publishing part will come in time. Cool, guys. Okay. I think that's everything for me, because I could talk forever, and even though we're all locked in our houses, I appreciate everything. People have other things to do, but I do really appreciate you taking the time, and I really appreciate the messages of support, and I'm hopefully was able to add something to your current way of working and what you want to do and how you want to achieve it. And I wish you all the best of luck, because there will be a time post-corona. I know it will happen, and I know you're all going to do very well. So stay strong, keep positive.